today on Redemption from Death Row, we're going to be talking to Bill Nogueira about his neighbor. It's a famous neighbor. And who would that be? The Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. One of the most vicious serial killers of all time. He was on the same tier as Richard Ramirez up until when Ramirez died, I believe, in 2013. He knows him, studied him, behavioral, watching him, conversed with him. Knows his in and outs. I want to know what Richard Ramirez was like. Is he really this god-awful serial killer that everybody feared? Or is he just the creation of the media, per se? I don't know. He certainly was a serial killer, and from what I know, one of the most vicious. He didn't have an MO, and that always bothered me about him. It's hard to trace that. When you not only kill young women, but you also killed old women. And you didn't just kill white young men, you killed old black men, or Mexican men, or you molested children. All of these things Richard Ramirez did. And he killed by knife, he killed by gun, he strangled, he bludgeoned. That's an evil man in my book, okay? Ripping out somebody's eyeballs and putting them on the dresser or in the jewelry. I mean, just despicable, horrible things that you could possibly imagine. Bill knows him. Actually, I think Bill told me when he first got there in county prison, he got in a fight with Richard Ramirez or something. I'll have to ask him about that but I do kind of remember something like that when I first started talking to Bill. Let's see what he has to say about the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. So stay tuned and let's see what we can hear. Somebody who I considered now, and right now, probably the evilest serial killer that I know of, that I've researched, and that is the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. Now, Bill Nogueira may have a different opinion on that because Bill has lived with Richard Ramirez for a long time. He studied him, he's talked to him, he knows everything there is about him. He knows stuff that the average person obviously doesn't know, and things that I don't know. And I want to learn more about this person who's called the Night Stalker. So, Bill, tell me about your knowledge about Richard Ramirez and the background and how you got to know him.
Well, obviously, Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison. And when he got here, I was here. He lived on the same tier with me, which is the fourth tier of the East Block unit. And he lived a few cells from me. Now, of course, he is, in my opinion, the greatest media invention that ever existed. Because they had this guy as this, stalker, killer, intelligent guy who, moved through walls. He was almost a supernatural being. And when I saw him, when I had a chance to study him, none of those things, really struck true to me. Now, he is a killer. There's no doubt. He is an evil person. He is a creepy guy. He is not intelligent. He barely writes. His mannerisms are almost feminine. And it strikes people a little funny, but remember, I know the real Richard Ramirez, not the guy that the media portrayed or that they invented. He loved that name, Night Stalker. And here in prison, they used to call him Brujo, which is Brujo. Brujo means witch or warlock. He dressed in black, he walked around, and he really had a different sense of what prison would be like. He thought, and I'm sure that he fed into the media's interpretation of who he was. So he comes to death row, and he believes everything's the same. Everybody fears me. Everybody's going to walk away from me or pay homage to me. He had this twisted sense of what prison's like. So, Ken, let me explain to you that there are inmates in prison and there are convicts in prison. And there is a huge difference between the two. An inmate It's just a guy who's in prison doing time for whatever reason. It could be horrible reasons, but he doesn't understand the prison culture. The convict is a man who is in his element. He's around criminals, and in this particular environment, he is the apex predator. He is the predator. He is the guy that people fear. He is the person that people respect. Because in prison, your ability for that ultimate goal, which is to kill somebody else, is really the only language spoken here. Richard Ramirez didn't speak that language. The first day he went out to yard, he was assaulted viciously. They didn't know he was going out. They weren't prepared for him, but they viciously attacked him, sent him to the hospital. Then he comes back from the hospital, and this is before I really get to know him. He's on a tier. I know what's happened to him. I knew prior to him going out what was going to happen to him. So he gets back. He waits 10 days. He tells the administration he believes it may be a mistake, that they mistakenly attacked him thinking he was somebody else. That's nothing further from the truth. He goes out again. This time they're ready, and they stab him, nearly killing him. So that tells you how people feel about serial killers in prison. What the public doesn't know is that serial killers give criminals a bad name. I know that sounds a little funny, but the truth is that criminals have a code of ethics. And rape, child molestation, serial killer actions are based on gratification, sexual gratification, all these psychological things that really insult a convict. Because a convict's there to do a job. If he's robbing a bank and someone grabs his gun, he shoots the person. The way they think is business is business. Now, a guy that I know told me one time, and he was giving me an example. This is when I first came to jail, and he told me, Bill, listen, if I'm doing a robbery with 3 guys, and one guy grabs my gun, who's a victim, and I shoot him, that's business. That's a terrible thing, but it's business. But what if my partner comes up to me and tells me, listen, man, hold my gun. I'm going to rape this woman. I'm pulling my gun. I'm shooting him in the head. I don't care if he's my partner now. He just turned my God-honest crime into a perversion. So that's how convicts feel about serial killers, rapists, and child molesters. They are to be exterminated at all costs.
Tell me a little bit. That was great insight there. And me as a detective, as an investigator, as a criminologist, I want to learn as much as I can about the elements of murder and try to hone that craft so I can prevent it or stop it in the future. So when I study Richard Ramirez and I look at his crimes, and
this call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
And I see that he kills indiscriminately, meaning older couples, male, female, young couples. He even molested children. And so for me as an investigator, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around that because he's not giving me an MO. He's not giving me an organized killer at one scene, but he gives me a disorganized at another scene. And I can't grasp it. And that's why I think, at least in the detective world, he's not held in high regard by no means. But I mean, he is looked upon as like an abnormal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. He is a serial killer who mixes motives, his victims, his gender, his age, his sexuality. What he does have, which is what gratifies him. And you look at his crime and you say, well, it's obviously sex-driven. What is sex-driven for him, and please bear with me on this, for him, the gratification is control. It's a psychological gratification. And what he has done that another serial killer in California did as well, which was the Golden State Killer, was he sexualized control. That he was able to control his victims so thoroughly was his gratification. And he was able to, in his mind, he was able to sexualize it. And once he did that, it didn't matter really what the victim was or who the victim was. That's why you have male, you have female, you have young, you have Asian, you have white, you have Mexican, you have any gender. He's one of those guys that killed Sometimes he was organized, sometimes he was disorganized. Sometimes it was by chance, sometimes it was planned. He didn't have an MO, and you're absolutely correct on what you said. He is a different animal.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
Nonetheless, he is a serial killer, and he was very prolific. The one thing that also stands out is how quickly he accelerated. You have serial killers who will kill, take a break. Some law enforcement call it that they go dormant for a while. This guy, as he killed, he just began to accelerate because it was an adrenaline rush. It was the control. It was everything. It was the media as well. The media fed this guy's ego. It fed his own narcissistic viewpoint of himself, and he just felt he had to feed it more and more and more.
Yeah, and I think that's, like you said, because he didn't have an MO. It's what intrigued, at least me, as an investigator, to say, and the things that he did inside those homes, you know, pushing out the eyeballs of some of the victims, and just the way he killed. I always, and I know there's probably others out there, Bittner, I believe that you know of, that are more vicious and sadistic than Richard Ramirez. But on the surface, Richard Ramirez, to me, is one of the most evil people that I've ever come across.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And look, this guy had a persona he loved. The media had him as almost a rock star. He'd get hundreds of pieces of mail. Actually, when the tier officer would come on a tier to hand out everyone's mail, usually get a couple letters. They had to stop passing out mail to bring what's basically a duffel bag full of mail for this guy. This guy was getting fan mail like he was the freaking Angus Young from ACDC. It's just incredible, the misdiagnosis, the misinterpretation of who this guy was, and it was mostly by young, good-looking women who were enthralled by the media really invention of who Richard Ramirez was, and it was an absolute lie. The guy was a pervert. He was a creep, a child molester. He is what any woman would think the most repulsive individual that he was. He was also, his hygiene was horrible. I mean, he didn't shower for weeks on end. He didn't comb his hair. He just was a very unkept individual.
Well, speaking of that, because that's what, the insiders, my audience, my fans, they like to know that stuff. So I was just going to ask you, and as a perfect segue to it, is do you have any, inside stories between any interactions between you and him or him and somebody else that you can share?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, this is what I do, Ken, and watching people is what I do. And I watched him for a number of years, and actually it was closer to 2 decades because he lived very close to me. And what he was known for on death row, and look, I mentioned criminals, convicts, and inmates. There are a lot of inmates on death row. There are a few convicts, and the inmates would interact with him. One of the things that he was known about, and he had a partner in crime, and his partner was Lawrence Bittaker, who was known as the Toolbox Killer. He had a van called the Murder Mac, and they'd go around killing young girls between the ages of 13 and 18. What this guy and Richard Ramirez did, because they lived right above from each other, Richard Ramirez lived in a particular cell, and Bittaker lived right beneath him. What they did was they were known as the porn kings of death row. So they had every kind of porn that someone wanted to buy or look at or whatever. So, of course, I'm curious to know what it is that floats this guy's boat, what he's doing. One of my guys that I worked out with was his neighbor, his actual neighbor, and he would occasionally, at my behest, speak to him and ask him to look at some of the things he had. And of course, once he got in his cell, he showed me. Well, his pornography was everything from child porn to women in bondage and just crazy stuff, stuff of gay origin. But the thing that really stuck out to me was in his personal books, all the eyes were cut out of the women that he had. He drew heads cut off. He put stab wounds in all the victims. He slashed throats. he wrote words like slut,
You have 60 seconds remaining.
like slut, whore, and different words of description of women and men too. So this guy was twisted beyond what you could ever imagine. But his thing was very aggressive porn, and he had it. And at that time, back then, people on death row could buy whatever they wanted to from any vendor and keep it. Now they cannot.
Wow. Okay, you want to give me a call back and we'll finish?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So go ahead and continue with your thoughts on the bondage and pornography that Richard had.
Well, it just shows the control. His whole, you mentioned before, he really didn't have an MO. True and untrue. He didn't have really a real signature, but he was all mixed. His MO basically was to break into homes in the evening and shoot the male first in the head, and then go on to sexually assault the women and then control the situation. So there was a bit of an MO in what he did. Now, when he came to prison, it just shows the same type of mentality. And I've said this many times. Serial killers are not created, they're born this way. And people have argued that, well, Richard Ramirez was the perfect candidate to become a serial killer because his uncle was a Vietnam vet. He cut women's heads off in Vietnam. He raped them. He showed Richard Ramirez the photographs, what he did. And then, of course, he shot his wife, meaning his uncle, I believe his name is Miguel, shot his wife in front of Richard. And, of course, that traumatized him so much that he became a serial killer. Well, I understand that, and I understand where the experts come up with that. But in most cases, people don't respond to that type of violence by becoming a serial perpetrator. Now, they could become violent, they become drug addicts, they use drugs, but to continue to seek that gratification when you're murdering, and killing on, and sexually violating people and children, this guy was just a twisted pervert, and he was born that way. Now, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. On death row, when they call visiting.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
And yes, on death row, they give you contact visits. I'm sure people are like, what? They do. It's not like a screen like you see on death row in other states. In California, they go to a visiting room where it is a contact visit. So before you go to your visit, they usually call you between 15 minutes before your visit. You're going to have a visit, prepare yourself for your visit, an escort is coming to get you. Give me a moment.
Yep.
Okay. Hopefully that won't continue too much longer. But so when they do that, they send what's called an escort to come get you. They make you turn around, they cuff you, they open your door, and then they escort you to the visiting room where they uncuff you and release you into the visiting room. Now, that is significant because it shows he does plan things. So what Richard did when they called his name for this particular day, they actually named, and they usually name the escort, who was coming to get you. Like, for example, Correctional Officer Maines, go get Ramirez for his visit. He heard this. The person they called to come get him was a woman. So the woman approaches his cell between 10, 15 minutes before his visit, and finds that his cell is dark. She's not thinking anything because she does this so many times it becomes routine. She opens his tray slot, which is locked.
Everybody's getting visits.
What's that, Richard?
I said everybody's getting visits right now, huh?
Well, those are for medical. They start calling medical, and they had an emergency count right now, so we're on standby. What's going to go on? Are they going to run yard? Are they not going to run yard?
I see.
So it's a little hectic, so hopefully he won't talk too much. But she opens his tray slot where it's locked, and that's where they put your trays in, because death row people eat in their cells. They don't go to a chow hall because basically they don't trust these guys to go into a chow hall, because they'll kill each other. And I say these guys because I am no longer really on death row. I do live here, but I will be leaving because I've been sentenced to a lower sentence. So to to Richard Ramirez, he opens a tray slot, and this guy, at that moment, pushes his penis through the tray slot and ejaculates on her.
Jeez.
Of course, she hits the alarm, but he got what he wanted. In his mind, he was able to control the situation, and he sexualized it by he masturbated. So, of course, they gavel him up, they grab his ass, they take him to the hole. He walks by my cell with a huge grin on his face. This is the kind of guy that Richard Ramirez is. This is the reason that other convicts want to kill him.
Well, that kind of leads me to this question for you, Bill, is these serial killers, let's just stick with Richard Ramirez. He's out on the street, he's murdering these people for control, for power, for the gratification that it gives him. And now he comes to prison. How does he squash that gratification that he so long desires for, that he was getting out in the street? How does he get that in prison?
Well, in a lot of cases, they relive what they did with photographs because he's on death row. And I've talked about this before. I've told people, look, you send a guy to death row and you're thinking, because the DA said, look, we're being hard on crime, this guy must die. What people don't understand is the appeal process takes 20, 30, 40 years. In that time, he has to participate in his own defense. Therefore, he can ask his lawyers, which he has an army of lawyers, to send him every photograph of every victim in the case. And he has a right to see it because he has the right to participate in his defense. Richard Ramirez has photographs of every one of his victims in the crime scenes, bloodied and everything else, with his work on the walls. He wrote Jack the Knife. He wrote all kinds of things. He set eyeballs in jewelry boxes. He got photographs of that, and he's allowed to have it. So he relives it. When that isn't enough, he pulls off the stunt that he pulled right there by basically sexually assaulting a female guard.
So the killing itself, I mean, he doesn't have to go out into the yard and shank somebody because he gets no gratification from the actual killing itself right there. It's the control. It's everything that leads up to that. Is that right?
That is correct, but he's also a coward. He's not going to go to a yard with a bunch of apex predators who are guys that are in prison who make other prisoners scared. So the yards on death row are very scary. There's a lot of apex predators out there. And it's not the predator that the public or the audience thinks. They're not 50 different Richard Ramirez's or BTKs. No, those guys are vermin. They're scared. They don't leave their cells. They're always in protective custody. The guy that I'm talking about is a guy who is in his environment in prison. He's a tough guy. He's a big guy. He's very strong. He's very aggressive. That's the guy. That's the convict I'm talking about. Richard Ramirez could never go out to these yards and try something because they'd mud stomp him to death. He's just not that guy. These yards are very territorial.
Yeah, so, I mean, he's not going to get any gratification anyhow if he was to kill somebody out in that yard, is my opinion. He doesn't get the gratification that way. It's through fear. It's through control. And he's not going to have anybody fear him out there.
That's correct. And Richard Ramirez is a perfect example of that. And they are placed in such protective custody. And it's the reason that I got the insight that I got. Not just by watching these guys. And I did speak to Richard Ramirez on a number of occasions. I talked to him. I wanted to get a feel for who he was. And I did so not because I wanted to be his friend. I wanted to interrogate him. I wanted to know where he came from. But the reason I got so much insight into this is because the warden of San Quentin himself and the director of the California Department of Corrections placed me on a special yard to become the IDAP worker, the Inmate Disability Assistant Program Director. And I was on those yards providing care for the elderly. It just happens that this yard was a protective custody yard for basically all the serial killers on death row who were in protective custody. That's how I got close to them. That's how I got the information that I have. And that's why I have such a bird's eye view of what these guys do when they're not performing, when they're just being who they are and sharing what they share amongst each other.
So when you were with Ramirez talking to him and him being just who he is, Ramirez, what was your impression of him when you were talking to him? Besides, he probably had bad breath.
Well, yeah, that is absolutely correct as well, because his teeth were rotten to hell. Just that he was a very flip guy. He thought that everything was so cool. He would talk about anything under the sun. He was just, when you talk to this guy, there's always a creepiness about him, in every sense of the word. His looks, his dirtiness, but his attitude and how he talked, it was just very flippant. It was like, no big deal. Everything is cool. I'm here. No worries. But, of course, a guy like me sees right through that. It's an act. You can tell it's an act. But the guy didn't have a conscience. He didn't care. As I said, he got photographs. He had photographs of all his victims in his home. He had them in albums. He had them next to Pornography in the same book. I know because I got a chance to look at one of them. And I took notes on everything he wrote. All the eyes were cut out. The women's throats were slashed. There were stab wounds. A lot of literary words like slut, whore, and things of that sort, even when it came to men and children. So, very disturbing. I mean, sure, you want to scream at the guy, you want to grab the throat, but that would have killed my study of him. So I had to keep myself in check and just learn as much as I can. So at some point, I didn't have the foresight to know that I'd be speaking to you 10 years later. But there was an idea forming in my head that if I could get this information, give it to the public, possibly solve cold cases, and of course, give a bit of finalization to victims' families or make the public safer because of the information that I have.
Well, you said he was assaulted when he first got there. What did he change after that? Did you notice a pronounced change in him at all?
Well, the change was he refused to go outside. He was very quiet for a while. He remained. He didn't speak to many people. He was a little paranoid too. That's one thing that I didn't mention. Richard Ramirez was very paranoid. If he walked in a tier and you stuck your mirror out to watch him, he immediately slowed down and he walked a wide berth of your cell. He was afraid someone was going to spear him with a spear, which they do in prison, and there's been people killed that way. Guys roll up newspaper extremely tight where it's almost like a tree branch. They stick an 8-inch knife at the end of it, and they shove it to the bars with such speed and accuracy that it'll puncture someone's lung or kill them. He was afraid of that. So after he was assaulted, he always gave people's cells a wide berth, especially if he saw a mirror come out. And look, I'm not going to lie to you. I purposely did it. He'd come by my cell, I'd stick my mirror out, and then I'd shove it in really quickly and wait. And of course, he would slow down, and then he would walk a wide berth myself as far as he could away from my bars, and then kind of almost run by.
Okay. I was just curious if you know how behavior changes after an assault. If he learned, hey, I'm not the top dog here. I've learned that real quick, so I'm going to have to change my behavior in order to survive.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And look, not that I'm a sadistic guy, but I was at law library one time, and he came in with double escort because they were afraid someone's going to do something to him. And one of the guys next to me, who is a convict, Richard Ramirez asked him a question about something when he was in the cell next to him. And these are brick wall, they're like kennels. You can't see the person next to you, but you can hear them. Mm-hmm. And Richard Ramirez asked the guy if he was done with a particular penal code section. But he sounded kind of scared. And the guy chuckled. And Richard asked him, why are you laughing? He said, I have good news and I have bad news for you. The good news is you're not paranoid. The bad news is I want to kill you. I mean, that's the type of messing with his mind that people did in here because they wanted to mess with him. They didn't like him.
So then did he just learn pretty much to stick to himself except for the one partner you said that he hung out with?
You have 60 seconds remaining.
Well, as I mentioned, he became
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
A lot of different inmates would seek him out to look for pornography and they talked to him. But the apex for the convicts, they never talked to him. Gang members never talked to him. They wanted to kill him.
Wow. Good insight. All right, you want to give a call back?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
All right. Hey, Ken.
Okay, so what else can you tell me and tell the audience about old Richard Night Stalker Ramirez?
Well, only that there are now a lot of stories once he's passed away that his ghost haunts the cell which he was in, which is the fourth tier cell 110. And for a number of years, that cell remained empty because guys wouldn't go into that cell. They said they saw things. I actually interviewed a few people that actually went into that cell, and within a very short period of time, they left that cell. They didn't want to be anymore because they said they saw things happened to them, and they wanted nothing to do with that cell. We know that he died. He died of liver malfunction. And look, he's just nothing that people should not admire this guy. I know people are very intrigued by this guy. I hope that what I've shared gives you insight into the kind of person he was. He wasn't a good person in any way, shape, or form. He was an insect, a killer without conscience that was only worried about one thing, his own gratification. He didn't care about you or anybody else. And the women he wrote, he just used them. And he was not a good guy.
Well, it's funny you mention about the cell, because I'm not going to lie to you. Well, listen, number one, I don't particularly believe in ghosts or anything like that. However, I will tell you this, Bill, is the other day, 2 or 3 days ago, I was doing a video and I brought up the name Richard Ramirez, that we were going to talk about him. And when I said his name, and it's captured on my video, a book fell from over and scared the piss out of me. It fell on the floor. And people saw that and commented that, as soon as you said Richard Ramirez's name, you had a book fall, and then your face was priceless. I said, yeah, well, scared me a little bit.
Yeah, no, look, I'm a lot like you are in that sense, that I tend not to believe things like that, but I do believe in this place is a bad place, Ken. I don't think there's a place in the Western Hemisphere that for the past 168 years has had as much trauma, fear, death, torture, murder, executions than San Quentin prison. This place is a bad place. There's a lot of fear here. People fear going outside. Some guys spend 20, 30 years in their cells because they're afraid to come out because of the men that walk these halls. So there's a lot of bad energy here. A person with Richard Ramirez's type of obsessive anger, control, just evilness, I can see where possibly some of that residue was left here, and this prison just basically enhanced it. This isn't a good place. And look, I've shared this with you. I've actually written a book about this place and the paranormal. And Richard Ramirez is one of those stories, and one of the guys that was in that cell, I interviewed him, and the story he told me was pretty shocking, very scary, and a lot of guards here talk about the same thing. They see things in the theaters. They see former inmates walking. They see a lot of weird stuff. And,
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
If you mention his name again and something else falls, maybe you shouldn't mention his name.
Yeah, if that happens again, I'll certainly think twice. But so he was known to be into devil worshipping. At least that's what the media portrayed. And he held up his hand, at trial or whatever, and said, "Hail Satan." Did you see any of that of him inside the prison?
Yes, and that's one thing I should have brought up, that he did have black Bibles, and he did subscribe to different occult magazines, and people said he heard him chanting over there. One of the guys who lived next door to him told me that he would constantly chant. And was he really into that? Did he really believe it? I don't know, but he seemed to be living that lifestyle. His cell had pentagrams on it, had things in red paint, because we could buy paint for the Holly program. He painted red pentagrams in the cell. He had different writings of occult teachings, and so he absolutely did that.
For how long?
Weird guy. What can I tell you?
I mean, did he
The
do
whole
it?
time he was here.
Is that right? So it stayed with him that even what was he in his 50s when he died? 60s?
Well, yeah, he was in his 50s, I believe, when he died. Yeah, he was 2013 when he died, I believe. And yeah, actually the person who cleaned his cell was a block worker that I know. And he showed me some of the things that he pulled out of his cell. It's like, well, let me look at that. I looked at it. Of course, I can't keep it because it is personal property of someone else. But I was looking through the stuff, a lot of occult things, a lot of black Bibles, a lot of pictures of, with the horned goat, with the symbols, books on Aleister Crowley, a number of those type of books.
Wow. Very good insight. There's a lot of things there that I liked hearing, in regards to doing further research into serial killers. And I particularly liked the thought that he was scared to go out into the yard, because I think of all the fear that he put into an entire community, probably entire state of California at one point in time. And for me to think that he had that little bit of same fear going out into the yard is almost like poetic justice for me.
It is, absolutely. And people tormented him. Convicts took every opportunity to try and scare him or try to make him feel unsure of himself. And because they felt, as you just mentioned, that he terrorized an entire community, an entire state of California. And a lot of these guys here have mothers, sisters that told them, is that guy there? Oh, he's a horrible person. That sticks to these guys' minds. And look, the truth is that had he gone outside, again, they would have killed him. And he knew it. They made it very clear. Unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because, look, I don't have any love for this guy in any way, shape, or form. The guy that went after him with a knife wasn't that experienced and didn't really know what he was doing. He put a hurting on him, but he didn't know what he was doing. Had it been an experienced convict, they would have killed him that day.
Wow. All right. Well, anything else you want to relay about Richard before we end this?
Well, no, just that he is the greatest media invention that I've ever seen. He's nothing like what they portrayed him on the street, because he was just a scared guy who, with evil, think of Gollum from The Lord of the Rings. That's how I see Richard Ramirez, as Gollum.
Well, I don't know who that is because I've never watched that, but I'm sure people in the audience there, they'll probably know.
Well, if you look him up, you'll find what Gollum is. He's a little creepy guy who, given a chance, and you turn his back on him, he will try and kill you.
Okay. All right. I'm going to end it. 1 second. Well, there you have it. There's Bill's interpretation of the Night Stalker. And kind of ironic of what I said is that he was a creation of the media in a way. And how he went out to the prison and go to the yard. You're not the alpha dog. Nobody's scared of you. You put the whole state of California in fear for your viciousness and your unpredictability of breaking in homes, getting the nickname, the Night Stalker. Song from AC/DC, the Night Stalker. I mean, you have all this, and you're reading it. Everybody's in fear. You go to prison expecting the same thing, and they ain't scared of you. And in fact, they tried to kill you. I bet you it was a very humbling experience for old Richard with his stupid sunglasses on at trial. One of the things, it was great insight by Bill. Great. One of the things that really took me back was that he was still studying the occult and devil worshipping up until he died. I thought that was probably just a phase, if I had to bet, But apparently not. And that he tried to go out into the yard and was beat up, and then they tried to kill him. And how pornography, Ted Bundy said that a lot, about how pornography fueled that. And that's what I was trying to get at with Bill, with quashing down those urges, Isn't it crazy how they can have crime scene photos because of discovery and because of their defense, and they just relive it over and over again, probably trade it with the other serial killers. took some notes here of what I thought was important. How the control and the power was what Richard Ramirez got off on. Great insights by only the person that could tell you. Another inmate there that was housed with the Night Stalker Richard Ramirez. So, hope you enjoyed this edition of Redemption from Death Row. And, you know what? I guess until next time, Main's out.